Hello everybody, it's Mrs. Bennett-Morgenstern, and for this lesson I'm going to introduce you to watercolor paint very briefly and then some watercolor techniques. And this would be the same thing again that we would be doing in the classroom, so it is kind of important for you if you're going to move on to painting on your own and Art 3. So the first thing that I want to talk about is watercolor paper, because watercolor paper is a little bit different than drawing paper or printmaking paper. It comes in two different styles. One is called cold pressed and one is called hot pressed. And the reason why I mention that is because I have an example of both. And you can always develop your own preference for the type of paper that you like to use. But first and foremost, what makes watercolor different from other papers is that it's made from cotton rather than trees. So it's infinitely more absorbent. It tends to pull the pigmentation into the little tiny fibers that make up the paper surface. And depending on the type of press that you're using, you can see that some of the textures will show through given the type of paint that you're using. I don't know if we can see it in this video, but I have a piece of cold pressed paper in front of me, and I don't know if you can see the kind of different kinds of texture that it has on it, and that comes from the way that it's rolled out. I also have here, these are my personal blocks of watercolor, and you can see at the edge there's black glue all the way around the edge of the watercolor block, and there's several sheets of paper that are glued together, and there's a key in the top. When I'm all done with an artwork, I can take a mat knife and stick it in between the pieces of paper, and I can cut around the edge and cut the artwork off. The reason why we like our paper to be secure is as the paper is absorbing the watercolor from the watercolor painting process, it's buckling. So think of it as a paper towel. It's sucking it in, and the paper is starting to expand and contract as it's getting wet and then drying. So one of the first things I'm going to do is prepare the paper. Here is the other block that I have. This is the hot pressed, and it tends to be a lot more smooth. I prefer to use the cold press, although I have done quite a few paintings on the hot press. These watercolor blocks you can get at Amazon. And they are at the art stores. You really don't find these at a, discount place. So watercolor paper is made from cotton. It also can be made out of recycled cotton, like t-shirts. And it's usually white, or sometimes it's cream colored. And I have a couple of artworks where I've actually tea stained it. So I've put it in a bath of tea and let the tea stain it kind of an off, older looking brown, not quite as brown as the board, but just to make it look almost antique. Kind of a neat way to prepare your paper. Talk about the board underneath. I have a piece of masonry board, very similar to what we use in the ceramics room, and this is in place of what the workboard is in the classroom, the big thick piece of wood that you use for drawing boards. We also use them for watercolor painting because I'm actually going to attach this to the surface. I also have my professional watercolor set. Okay, you can see that these are all the colors I have, and I am a little old school, so I try to mix a lot of my own colors here on the palette. You should all know about color mixing and how it works. But one of the great things about watercolor sets is that they last a really long time. I've had this one since 2007, and yes, I don't paint very often, but they do last a long time, and you can pop these individual containers out and then just buy the color that you're missing. So it really can save a lot of money, and it's great because you know you can always replace the colors that you're using a lot. I am going to do the demonstration today using the classroom watercolors, and these are Prang watercolors. Prang. And you can get these online. That's probably the best place to get them. But you can also get them at probably a better art store. Again, not at a discount place. And this is from the classroom. It has a little palette in its cover, place for a couple of brushes, and these pop out, just like in my professional set. So what is watercolor all about? Again, just like tempera, it's one of the older types of paint, and it's made by putting powdered pigment into a vehicle that's made of some pretty easy to find materials. The first and foremost being gum acacia. Gum acacia is the sap of the gum acacia tree. It's grown in the Middle East, okay? And it pretty much grows year-round, and it seeps out sap. They collect it, and it is primarily used in food production. I actually ate some ice cream the other day because it tends to be very sticky when it melts. I had some ice cream the other day, and this was one of the ingredients, so it's pretty non-toxic. The toxicity in watercolor paint comes from the pigments, not the vehicle. The other thing that can be in watercolor paint is honey. And the third ingredient that can be in a watercolor paint is glycerin, which is kind of a waxy substance. And these are all things that you can find. I know they sell glycerin at a drugstore. The gum acacia you can order online. It's the formula that I'm not quite sure at. I buy my watercolor medium already made. I'm going to show you how I make watercolor paint in another video. One of the things I have learned is that the amount of gum acacia makes the watercolor shiny. So as I tilt this palette, you can see the shine on the watercolor. Now, it was my understanding from my classes when I was in school that the shinier the watercolor paint, the better quality it is. The less likely it's going to fade in sunlight. That is one of the problems with watercolor, is that you do have to keep them out of direct sunlight or else they'll just start to fade away. So if you bought this watercolor set for $7 and did these size paintings like I'm doing here, this would probably last you a few years. My high school watercolor set, most of the colors, and they did not have replaceable pieces. Most of the colors were still around when I replaced it with this new one in 2007. So that was like 1984 to 2007. That's a pretty good investment for paint. Okay, I have a whole bunch of tools that I'm going to be showing you one by one. Just to remind you, though, first and foremost, is that when we use watercolor, especially at the beginning, the first steps in a process of watercolor painting, you're often going to use hair brushes. And again, these are from the classroom, except for this one. This one's mine. And again, the bigger the number on the brush, the bigger the brush is. So this one is actually a 3/4 inch brush. And we call this a wash brush, and you'll see why when I do the demonstration. Okay, so hair brushes, these are probably Camel. I also have a spray bottle, a little spray bottle of water. And I also have some warm water to wash my brush off with. Thankfully, it's not as, doesn't get in your brush as much as tempera or acrylic paint does, so it cleans pretty easily. And I always have to have an extra paper towel. This is, I keep in my hand and I wipe my brush off on it. I also have a paper towel to do a technique. Alrighty, so I'm going to start with the basic watercolor techniques here. And I have some painter's tape. You can use regular masking tape, but if you have this around and you're able to try this at home, even if you're using copy paper to do this, even if you're using drawing paper to do this, which is perfectly fine. The drawing paper works fine. I used it for years when I did watercolor with elementary kids. Watercolor paper is a little bit more expensive. I don't paint large artworks, so I can get 2 out of 1 page in my blocks. This, again, is the watercolor paper from the classroom. I'm going to put a nice frame around here, about 1/4 of an inch, and you will see how really nice this looks after it's been painted with an artwork. And I have examples to show you in a few minutes. When there's a frame around it, a little white frame, it's also where you're going to sign your work. It helps to have that little framing around there when you want to go to matte and frame your work, because usually with watercolor paintings, you don't just frame the artwork because it's on paper. You would put a matte on it. Okay, cardboard frame first, that kind of goes on top of the piece, and then the actual wooden or metal frame around that. I'm taking my fingernail and I'm sealing down the edges on the paper. Just running my fingernail over it. Okay, that way the paint doesn't leak underneath. And I have a pencil and eraser. With watercolor painting, and I'm going to talk more about like specific styles of painting in watercolor later, it's acceptable to have your pencil show through, but I just have it handy just in case. So any drawing that you do, you would do first. You wouldn't go very, very hard with the pencil. You would do it kind of in a sketching manner, and that is to just give you a guideline. I don't know if you noticed, but there's a color missing that we use quite a bit with other kinds of paint. Definitely use it when we're working with tempera, which is most of Art 1. White. Yes, there is no white in watercolor. Now, you can use white, but if you're kind of a purist or you really want to learn how to control the medium, the best way to do it is just to learn how to not use white as you're learning how to paint. Because I do watercolor for my own painting, it really benefits students because I can offer a lot of help and advice. And certainly if this is something that you want to try or you can try on your own, feel free to ask me any questions. And you know how to get hold of me. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is grab my very big wash brush. And the first technique that we're going to do is a wash. I'm just going to take plain water and I'm going to paint it, let's just say in the corner of the paper. And let that soak in for a minute. And put another layer on it, nice and clean. Washes are used quite a bit as background. The way to start the painting when you do watercolor is to work background to foreground and light to dark. So doing the background first, the sky if it's a landscape, or the wall if it's an interior, the farthest thing away. So to that end, I'm just going to use some blue paint, and I hope that you can see. I can't lift this up, unfortunately, because it's a very big board and there's things on top of it. But the paint is very watery and it's spreading around. The paper is starting to buckle a little bit, and I can leave some areas white, so maybe those are clouds. If I wanted to add some different colors to it, sometimes we see a little blue-green in the sky. I can wash off my big brush here, and I can take a little bit of yellow and kind of mix it in there with the blue. And it just gives the sky area a little more depth. This is not going to be a painting per se. It's a collection of techniques. So first one is wash. Just like you're washing the dishes, you're washing the paper. My water's a little bit dirty, but I'm going to continue with a wash across here. But I'm going to put two really, really distinct colors on here. I'm going to put the blue on one side. You can see it's starting to creep across the paper. And I'm going to put red coming from the other side. Where the two meet, or they start to meet, whoa, they're going to start to bleed together. They're kind of combining together. They won't necessarily make purple, you know, red and blue make purple, but it does give some interesting looks to it. Okay? I'm going to switch brushes right now because I don't really need to use the big wash brush anymore. I'm going to go to a slightly smaller brush. This is a number 8. Use these a lot in the classroom, this size brush. And now I'm going to, this is dried a little bit, so I'm going to I'm going to take some black and I'm going to go into this and show you what will happen if you take some pretty thick paint on the brush and put it over something that's still wet. It does bleed. This is called the wet on wet technique. And it's a good way to make clusters and clumps of a tree or a bush. You know, interesting atmospheric effects, or interior-wise, it could be the cushions on a bed or a big fluffy chair. You know, lots of puff to it. You can also use it to make things that are far away look like they're kind of blurry and at a distance. Now I'm going to dry off my brush a little bit. It's still wet. Actually, I'm going to wet the green paint. Dry off my bristles. So the bristles are dry, but they're not dried out. The brush is not completely dry. I'm going to take my tip, and on the dry paper, a little too dry. On the dry paper, I'm just painting brush strokes. Maybe some blue. Back to the green. Now some yellow. Okay, that's called wet paint on dry paper, wet on dry. And after the whole thing is dry, if you wanted to put details in with a darker color, so if you wanted to put tree branches over the sky that were very, very detailed with a very, very small, like 00 brush, you would wait till this wash was dry, and that's when you would use the wet on dry technique in order to create the branches. So you always work background to foreground and light to dark. But right now we're just kind of like messing around with techniques. Now this one, everybody likes to give it a try. I'm going to take my brush that's really dry and I'm separating the bristles. Okay, kind of fanning it out. And they actually have brushes that look like this. Okay, I have some. I might use them later on in another painting technique demonstration. Now I'm going to use this to create really subtle, I don't even know if you can see that in this video. Let me use black. Say you've got a grassy surface that you want to make. Yeah, you can see that. good to use for grass, hair, fur. All right. And one of my favorites, I'm going to use an even smaller brush now. I'm going to use black so you can see what I'm doing. I actually have an artwork that I'm going to show you in a second using this technique because I wanted to. It was such a perfect picture or part of a picture that I wanted to paint. I'm painting wet paint on the dry paper. So I'm going to put like a line down. Take my brush, wipe the excess off, and now I'm going to take the brush and I'm going to lay the water right next to it. And I'm going to pull the color down. So it's like a value scale. If you remember doing those in Art 1, I'm pulling the color down and out. And it's from dark to light. So if you needed to make something that's got volume or shading, good way to do it is to use pulling. All right, now we're going to get into some of the interesting tools that we have to use. Let me just grab something real quick. I have a metal straw I was drinking. Straw blowing. Always a cool thing to do. It's just fun. Kind of for something that's abstract. I'm putting a big blob of paint. It's easiest to do with watercolor or really watered down tempera paint. Of course, you just take the end of the straw, okay, and blow the paint around. And I kind of got into over my wash. It does what it does. It's just an abstraction. It doesn't have to look like anything real. That is a pretty self-explanatory. Wet paint, with a lot of water in it, blow it around. If you want to make a branch look really random, that's a good way to do it. Okay, if you're doing something that's abstract, go for it. Okay, put that aside. I had mentioned earlier that I had a piece of paper that I was going to use for a technique. This, I don't know if you can see, oh yeah, you can see it. This particular paper towel has a texture on it. Okay, so I don't want to scrunch this up. You can use it all crumpled up. I could actually use this, my drying piece, to do the same technique. But I'm going to see if I can get this texture onto the paper. So I'm just going to do a small area, and I'm going to do black so you can see it better. So I'm doing the wet paint on the dry paper. Kind of spreading it out with some water. And it's really getting caught in the tooth of the paper. I can see the actual texture of the paper. Now I'm going to take this and I'm going to lift it. Yep. I don't know if you can see it, but the texture, that design of the paper towel is in here. Okay, this is called lifting. Makes sense. I'm lifting the paint off the paper. See if this will print. Oh, nope, pretty dry. Okay, so you can use the other side of this, so I'm going to keep it to the side here in case I need it. So that's lifting. Next one is masking. And I have a really neat little artwork. I can't find it, though, to show you. But just like the edge of the paper here is going to have a white line around it, you can actually, let me do this. Yeah, I'm going to put it on my light area. Now that this isn't as dark anymore, and I'll do another piece. I'm tearing this. Say you wanted to make a birch tree. Birch trees are white. You could take the masking tape and create the tree shape with the masking tape. And then you could paint around it. And after it dries, you pull that up and you have the shape that you wanted in white, or if it's over another color and you paint a darker color on top of it. Okay, so that's called masking. They also have masking that's liquid, kind of like a whiteout type of thing. But it's like rubber cement. I don't know if you've ever used that before. I don't really use it in the classroom too much because it smells weird. It's probably bad for you. But you paint it on, you paint your painting, and then you peel it off after the fact. And then you have white underneath. There are several examples in the classroom of using masking. I just didn't, I didn't want to bring 8,000 artworks home to show you on these videos. So we're just going to go with what I have here. And if I can find that other artwork that I have, it's really nice to show you where I did some masking to make some birch trees. All right. Alcohol. And I'm not going to use the alcohol to show you because I don't want to waste the alcohol that I have. Okay. I have very little of it and I don't want to waste it on the artwork. But while the paint is wet in a wash, you can take a Q-tip or a dropper and you can drop alcohol on it. And depending on the quality of the paper underneath, you can get some really interesting effects with that. But again, that is something that, I don't want to waste the alcohol on because I just don't have a lot of it. And I have it in the classroom for you to use, but we're not there. Okay, last one. I saved the best for last because this is my absolute favorite watercolor technique, and a lot of my artwork uses this technique. I also use colored pencil in my artwork on top of the watercolor, but sometimes I just like to have fun with this. This is coarse sea salt. We got it from Stop and Shop. Okay, you want to use the coarse sea salt. Regular table salt we'll use, you just won't have a good of an effect. But like kosher salt will work. The kind of salt that's in a grinder, if you have one of those at home, that will also work. As long as it's kind of on the chunky side. But regular table salt would work. Just really sprinkle it very sparingly. Now, unfortunately, in the time that we have, this is not going to be ready for you to really see what it does. So I'm just going to show you examples of it. I'm going to go back to my big wash brush. And I'm going to use black again because I think that it will work the best for a demonstration. But I have examples that I'm going to show you where you can use any color. Okay, I'm just painting this on. I didn't make a wash. You can make a wash. You can kind of pretty much do whatever. We do want the paint to be kind of on the thicker side. You can do any of the other things that you want to do first. You can mask an area. Then I'm going to take, I always put it in my hand first. I don't want to waste it. Only because I don't want to have to go out for it again. And I'm actually just sprinkling it right onto the wet paint. Getting a little more. My dogs love this when I do it at home, even though they probably shouldn't be eating it. But if it falls on the floor, it's like, ooh, a treat. Putting a little more in one spot than another spot. You could be really selective where you put the salt. Now, let's think about what salt does in general. We know it melts ice on the outside, the halite, that type of salt, the rock salt. It absorbs things. So what it's doing right now, it's displacing the pigment. It's absorbing the water, but then it's also going to leave the pigment. And as that action happens, it leaves like an imprint in the paint. Okay? So it just gives it a really neat textural effect. Since I paint things with a lot of texture, it works great for me. And I'm going to show you an example of that right now. We're going to wait for this till a little bit, and before I end, I will pull off some of the stuff. I'm going to just blot that a little bit, speed it up. So here is an artwork using the salt technique. What do you think that looks like? All of those patterns are made from the salt just doing its thing. It's very random. And then I will admit that I love glitter, and I don't know if you can see it, but there is a very, very little bit of glitter on here. There's also some leftover salt, which is also a crystal, so it does sparkle a little bit on its own. That's kind of neat. So this was just something that I was messing around with. Well, another interesting thing about this piece of paper is it's got the watermark on it from the company that made the watercolor paper. And it's the edge, so you can see the decal on the edge of the paper. So nice hard crisp line from where the tape was. And it's all the colors that I like. The greens, the mossy greens, and the lichen on the rocks. Cool. And I had told you that I would show you an example of pulling. Well, there's a certain kind of plant called a begonia that makes absolutely spectacular flowers. And each flower's got like this, like a border around the edge of it. And all the veins of the colors start pouring down to the inside of the flower. So what I did here is I did a close-up of a begonia flower, okay, from the outside in, and I used the pulling technique in order to create that effect of each part of the flower petal is darker on the edge than it is on the inside. Okay? There's a couple of artists that I admire that, you know, did flower paintings. I'm not going to mention them here because I might want to use them in another demonstration. All right, before we end, just want to recap. You get my pencil pointer. We started out with a wash. Then we did wet on wet and let things bleed together. Then we took some of the just wet paint and painted using brush strokes. Fanning the brush out when it's dry and dipping it into wet paint just at the tips and creating dry brush technique. Here we did some lifting with a paper towel. Here we did some masking, which I will get back to in a minute. This is the pulling the color out and creating like a value scale. And last but not least, a little bit of salt action, and it's really, really going to town here. I know it's really hard to see, but we'll look at it before we do the techniques the next time, the painting the next time. That didn't work very well. It was too wet for me to put the masking tape on. There we go. Hard to see from your angle. But again, I'll recap this before I do the next demonstration. Now, for an artwork, if you want to, go for it, like I said, you can use copy paper. Just try to tape it to something and make an abstraction. It doesn't have to look like anything. You can go crazy on it. You don't have to make anything realistic. You can just experiment with different watercolor techniques. Okay, see you next time.